Have you ever wanted to use 22.5 degree angles in your origami designs? Hey everybody, I'm Tim Rickman, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this 5th episode in my How to Design Origami with Box Pleating series. Let's first take a look at our simple feature. In regular box pleating, we begin with a flap created by a set of horizontal, vertical, and diagonal creases. When collapsed, the horizontal and vertical creases run along the axis of our flap, and the diagonal creases give us a set of 4 layers, 2 on either side. If we introduce an evenly spaced grid to this crease pattern, it allows us to make a series of reverses that thins down this flap. This is because the 45-degree crease allows the pleats to be placed on top of one another in each layer. Let's open this back up and take a look at the underlying structure. The horizontal and vertical creases create 90-degree angles, and bisecting those gives us 2 45-degree angles. If we bisect a 45-degree angle, we get 2 22.5-degree angles. Bisecting each of the 45-degree angles allows us to collapse this into a flap with 8 layers, 4 on each side. Let's take a look at what this flap looks like when we introduce a grid. If I orient the flaps like this, you can see that the lines in our grid run parallel to the axis. But unlike simple box pleating, if we look on the other side of this layer, you can see that the 22.5-degree angles do not allow the lines in our grid to fall evenly on one another. We need to create new creases in order to do this. We could fold through the layers using the existing creases running parallel to the axis, but this does not give us all the creases we need to be able to line this feature up next to other features in our crease pattern. I'm going to show you now the most simple way to spread this layer out evenly on either side of the axis. Spread the paper out like this and flatten. You want to try to get the base of this triangle to be parallel to the horizontal creases in the grid. Repeat this 2 more times. We run out of enough paper to be able to do this a 4th time and are left with this small triangular flap. You'll see why in a moment. Let's open the model back up and take a look at the new creases we've created. You may have seen shapes like this in other origami crease patterns you've looked at. To me, they kind of resemble kite shapes. This is the smallest kite shape we can build in our grid. I'm going to explain the rules that built this set of creases so we can build a larger version. You can see that the creases begin at this intersection, which is also the center of our flap, but it doesn't have to start there. It can start at any point along this diagonal line that's the intersection of 2 valley creases. This crease is created by bisecting the diagonal crease and this horizontal crease here. But it only travels up to the next horizontal crease. This next rule is important and is the reason why 22.5 degree angles are kind of tricky to work with. Once a 22.5 degree angle leaves a reference point in our grid, mathematically it does not pass again exactly through the center of another reference point. At least not any reference point that's going to be useful to us in box pleating. All you can do is have it end within the boundary of our feature on a crease which will travel off of the edge of our crease pattern for our feature. The top of our kite shape also begins at the intersection of two valley creases. To find it, measure the distance from the horizontal crease traveling to where the bottom of this kite shape is, and measure the distance up to this point here. Now measure that distance again to the horizontal crease above it, and follow that line over to the diagonal. This will be the reference point for the top of your kite shape. This will be another 22.5 degree angle. That is the bisection of this vertical crease and a horizontal crease that isn't built into our crease pattern. You can draw this in by drawing a straight line from that reference point to where this 22.5 degree angle touches this horizontal line. But let me show you that you can find this with origami technique as well. I'll add in an extra crease here that isn't really needed other than as a reference. And this allows us to create another 22.5 degree angle that touches the same point along this horizontal line as our first 22.5 degree angle did. All of this is mirrored on the opposite side of this diagonal. Travel this distance again above this horizontal. From this reference point, create a bisection of this crease and this diagonal that we'll add in. Just to that line. There will also be a crease that runs between these two corners. All of these creases allow us to do what we did when we spread out that flap earlier. Now let's use these rules to create a larger version of this kite shape on this section here. Remember that once a 22.5 degree angle has left its starting reference point, it will not land again exactly on another intersection in our grid. Build a 22.5 degree angle that travels as far to the edge of our crease pattern of our feature but still lands on a horizontal crease. Measure the distance from the bottom of our 22.5 degree angle to this horizontal crease that touches where it ends, and this time that distance is going to be 1, 2, 3. Move that distance again above this horizontal to this horizontal crease and follow that over to the diagonal line. This is the reference point for the top of our larger kite shape. Build another 22.5 degree crease that travels from this reference point to where this 22.5 degree angle meets this horizontal crease here, just to the side of one of our creases going vertically. You can free fold this, or you can make a bisection of a diagonal that's not in our crease pattern using an origami technique. Create an additional diagonal crease and then bisect between that crease and this vertical crease down to this line here. Now you're going to repeat all of that on the opposite side of this diagonal crease. And make a crease that extends from this corner to this corner. There's one extra step we need to do when we build this kite shape larger. All of the horizontal lines running into the side of our 22.5 degree angles need to be connected. The top and bottom one here already are with our axial crease here. And the next pairs of creases connecting these are going to run parallel to that diagonal crease. You can use a straight edge to draw these in, or you can free fold them. But one method I like to use is to look where this 22.5 degree angle crosses this horizontal line and move down diagonally and plot reference points roughly where that line will be, and you can see that it ends on the same spot down here, and then I'll use those to lightly draw in where that crease is going to be, so when I go to make it, I know that it's where it's supposed to be. And then do that same thing here. Your reference is going to be in a slightly different place. Move down to this next box, and it should land on the same spot where this crease touches this 22.5 degree angle. And you're going to repeat that on this side as well. Now we have all the creases necessary to be able to collapse this flap again. I'm going to start with this 22.5 degree angle as a mountain fold, valley, mountain, mountain, valley, mountain. This is what the whole flap looks like now when it's collapsed. And you can see that along the side we just built that kite shape. It's smooth along almost the entire length of the flap, unlike on the first side where we did the 3 tiny kite shapes, which has all these angles and layers. Like on this side, we have this tiny flap, and that also appears on this side. And as well, on this side, we also have this extra flap of paper, the smaller flap that's down by the base. I'm going to open this back up and look at the crease pattern and explain why that happens. But first, I'm just going to make a reference here by folding this flap all the way down as far as it will go, and I'll make a pencil mark. I'll move this flap of paper over to the side and do the same thing. That will allow me to describe this flap to you better by showing you its boundary. Alright, I'm going to open up the whole thing again. A flap can be represented as a circle whose center would be the tip of that flap, and whose radius determines that flap's length. So on this corner of the paper, that circle could be described like this. In normal box pleating, we use a square whose boundary lets us fill that space with this circle, but we end up with a lot of this paper over here that ends up more or less being unused. This relates to something people talk about in origami design called efficiency. This flap uses more than the minimum amount of paper needed to create this flap. Efficiency doesn't necessarily mean that you've made this feature incorrectly. It just relates to how much extra paper you have left over from creating the flap. There's plenty of situations where a less efficient flap will give you the look that you want for your model. So it's not a good or a bad thing necessarily. It's just a term that's used to describe this extra paper that gets left over. And that's where this extra flap comes from. When we use 22.5 degree angles, the boundary for our circle changes, because what we have is now a smaller flap in the middle that's defined by an octagonal boundary. So this is the boundary for a slightly smaller circle with the same central point. And you can see that much less paper is wasted within the boundary of that circle to the boundary. I've gone ahead and drawn in the boundary that surrounds the circle that represents that tiny flap that's at the base of our flap now. It's created in that sort of negative space that's outside of this boundary for the smaller large circle that's in the middle. And it gets created because outside of this circle we're trying to get the pleats to be uniform again for when they run off the side of this, so that we can match this up with other features in our crease pattern. Imagine that this paper extends, our grid goes out on all sides of this, and we're placing other features beside this one. So this gets created because of this negative space and the fact that we're trying to get all of our pleats to line back up evenly again outside of here. Outside of all of this, there's a river that forms so that we can reach the length of the entire flap. And that's where that tiny extra little bit of paper comes at the bottom here. And that's why we can't extend this kite shape any further out, because if it were to come off of the grid for this, it wouldn't allow us to resync up all of these pleats evenly. So that's an explanation of why we get that tiny flap. You can use that in your designs. The ratio is about 6:1. So if this flap is 1 unit long, not the units in our grid, but let's just call that a length of 1, this flap above it is going to be about 6 units. Mostly what people do though is they hide that extra paper by doing this. Bring together these points here, make this a mountain fold all along that top 22.5 degrees, and then hinge this down on a valley fold. And now you can see that these pleats line up, and you're just going to sink these through all of the layers. And this hides that extra little piece of paper in case you didn't want to use it. So what are some design reasons that you would want to use 22.5 degree angles for? Well, when we have a flap made out of just standard box pleating, if we open up the end of this, pop out the sides, and make the top
kind of flat, you can see it makes a box shape, which is kind of where box pleating gets its name. It makes box-like shapes. It has the ability to do that anyway. And we get 4 sides. But what if you wanted to build a shape that was more cylindrical? It had a more circular top, and instead of just 4, you wanted to further describe a round shape with 8 sides that were each even, and you wanted to use a grid so that you could connect that easily with other box pleated crease patterns for features. Well, I'll show you what that looks like. So let's take a look at what happens when we open up the end of a flap that's been created by an array of 22.5 degree angles. We get all of these flattened out. You can see now that instead of being a box shape, this creates more of a circular, well, really an octagonal top, and we have 8 sides running off the edge, which describes a little more accurately a cylinder. So that's another thing that you can do with 22.5 degree angles. One other thing you can do with this is that you can see that in normal standard box pleating, the point comes to a 45 degree angle. But there's some features like fingers or claws that you would want to come to a sharper angle. So let me show you what this would look like if we used 22.5 degree angles on all 4 layers of our flap. You can see that the end of this flap now comes to a sharper point. It's going to be a little easier to shape if you want to turn this into, you know, like end of a finger or something like that. That's one other reason that you could use 22.5 degree angles. One thing to remember that your flap has to at least be 1, 2, 3 units long in relation to your grid to allow for this angle, because it passes past the second line in a grid. So your flap would have to at least be 3 units long. There are other angles you can use to do that too, but with 22.5 degree angles it has to be 3 units long. Sometimes models are built with the paper positioned diagonally. A good example of this is my model Smaug. And at the bottom end of that model, I used a significant portion of that corner to create the tail. Now in standard box pleating, your creases would allow you to collapse a long flap like that along a corner, like this. And then these pleats would extend up into the model with other features beyond them. But the tail would be flat from the side. Let's say I wanted it to be flat from the top. Well, one thing we could do is to squish these all down and make them flat like this. And that looks pretty cool. It's got some texture to it, and it definitely allows us to fold this flap flat on either side of the axis. But what if we wanted it to be completely smooth? Well, we could use those 22.5 degree angles, and I've already pre-folded this along the whole length of that flap to give it a smooth texture. And as you can see now, instead of being flat from the side like it was before, it's flat along the top of the tail. And that's another thing that you can do with these 22.5 degree angles. So So that's about all I have to share with you today in this video about 22.5 degree angles. I do have some other techniques that I'm going to show you in the near future. Some techniques that I've been using lately to create some other shapes with these angles. But this is what usually shows up in crease patterns that you might be familiar with. So I wanted to explain this shape here. I'm going to leave a link or two in the video description down below to some other models that use these creases. And now that you know a little bit more about them, hopefully you can fold those models sort of as homework and learn a little bit more about them by collapsing them. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, like the video, share it, subscribe to my channel. All those things really help to show other people that this is quality origami content. And something I'd really like for you guys to do is to leave comments on other topics for design with box pleating that you'd like to see. That also really helps and gets you guys involved with this process and lets me know what kind of content that you want to see. I do plan on doing a lot more of these videos, so be sure to subscribe so you'll see when a new video comes up. Alright, I really appreciate you guys watching. I had a lot of fun putting this video together, and I'm going to say goodbye for now, and I'll see you in the next video.